In this video, we'll talk about working capital policy as an introduction to the general topic of working capital management. Okay. First, let's talk about net working capital or working capital. So when we talk about working capital management, the key item about working capital management is that this is the strategies, tactics involved in the management of current assets and current liabilities. So when we talk about management of current assets and current liabilities, that's short-term financial management. We're dealing with items that are important in the short run, or in terms of day-to-day operations, which is management of cash, management of receivables, inventories, and current liabilities. Okay, but this is critical because, as I have mentioned in the past, working capital is very critical because there can be no long-term future for a company which mismanages the short run, or which mismanages its short-term operations or day-to-day operations. So we've now delved into the topic of working capital management. Okay. First, we define what working capital is. Working capital is the portion of the firm's assets used in day-to-day operations. So the key word here is it is the portion of the firm's assets used in day-to-day operations, which implies that this actually pertains to current assets. Okay, so when we talk about working capital, it's synonymous to current assets. Okay, so the primary elements of working capital circulate from one fund to another in the ordinary course of business. We'll discuss that circulation later when we talk about the cash conversion cycle. Okay? So the conversion of current assets from inventory to accounts receivable to cash provides an important source of funds that firms use to pay current liabilities. So that circulation of money or circulation of capital that we're talking about in terms of its day-to-day operations of a company's day-to-day operations, that circulation is the conversion of funding or conversion of cash, from inventory to accounts receivable and eventually collected as cash. And then you use that cash to reinvest again in current assets, collect as receivables, and generate cash once more. So that circulation of capital is very important, and that's something that we will be focusing in the second half of the course. Okay. Now, the second term that we need to learn is net working capital. So when we say net working capital is the difference between the current assets of a company and its current liabilities. Current assets minus current liabilities, this is net working capital. Okay. This shows the net equity investment in short-term assets or in working capital. Okay. Current assets are the investments related to working capital. Okay. Current liabilities naman is the financing of those working capital. Okay, so the difference of the two, that's called net working capital. In essence, it refers to the equity invested in working capital. Okay. All right. So working capital management is very important because there is a significant trade-off or significant push and pull between profitability and risk when we talk about working capital management. Okay. Here you will realize that if you want high profitability, you want your net working capital to be as low as possible. Okay. But if your concern is risk, if you want the operations of a company to be less risky, then you will be biased towards a net working capital that is high. Okay, and we'll discuss more about that in the next slide. Okay, so profitability is the relationship between revenues and cost. We know that already. How can a firm increase the profits of its profits? It can be increased by increasing revenues or decreasing costs. Okay, So that's what profitability is. The risk that we are talking about in working capital management is the risk of insolvency. Okay? The risk of insolvency is the probability that a firm will be unable to pay its bills as they come due. So illiquidity, no, unable to pay its liabilities. That's the risk that we are trying to avoid. So yung sinasabi nating trade-off in this case is that if you want a company to be more profitable in terms of working capital management, the risk increases as profitability increases, due to working capital policies. However, if takot ka sa risk, gusto mo less risky ang working capital management mo, that usually means that profitability will have to suffer. Okay, and that's the principal trade-off between profitability and risk in working capital management. Okay. So other things being equal, the greater the firm's net working capital, the lower is the risk of insolvency. Okay, we'll discuss more about that later. Okay, and the converse is true, no? If there are more long-term assets, kasi mas malaki ang the long-term assets yield more returns to the company, right? So if you have more long-term assets, syempre you have less current assets. And if you have less current assets, your working capital is also less, no? And therefore it increases the risk of the company. So yun yung principal trade-off between the two. Okay, let's discuss that trade-off in a little bit more detail. So if there are changes in current assets, to understand how changing the level of the firm's current assets affects its profitability, let's consider a ratio. One ratio is this current asset to total asset ratio. So this ratio indicates the percentage of total assets that is current. Okay. Now, when this ratio increases, it means there are more current assets in the company. What is the effect on profit? The effect on profit is to decrease the profit. Why? What are current assets? So for example, inventories or receivables. Okay. These kinds of current assets usually have a lower return than investments in long-term assets. No? So if you have cash, will you be producing more inventory? Or for example, building an expansion of your plant or whatever facility which generates long-term revenues for the company. Okay. So if you have the same 100 million pesos, for example, of excess cash, if you invest it in inventories, the return of investing inventories is less versus when you invest it in a long-term facility, a long-term plant. Mag-expand ka ng planta mo, ang impact ng 100 million pesos, it's more sales from now moving forward. Right? Kesa i-invest mo yung same 100 million pesos sa inventories. Pag nabenta mo yung inventory na 100 million, tapos na. No? Kumbaga, there's no long-term impact if you invest that 100 million in more inventories rather than invest that 100 million in another building or another production line. If you do that, then that para siyang an investment that keeps on giving because annually you've got more production and therefore you can sell more in the longer run. So the returns of this investment will be higher than an investment in inventory. That's why we say that when we invest more in current assets, the effect on profitability will decrease. Because long-term assets are more productive. When you invest in long-term assets, usually multi-year yung impact. But if you invest in inventories, pag nabenta yung inventory, tapos na. No? The return is less. Okay, that's why when we say that there is more current assets, there's a decrease in profit. There's a decrease in profit versus a scenario that it could have been invested in long-term assets. Okay? And because you have more current assets, you have more liquidity. And if you have more liquidity, then it decreases the risk of the company as a whole. Okay? Now, if you have less current assets, it implies that you are investing more in long-term assets. And as I have previously explained a while ago, long-term assets have a higher return than short-term assets, and therefore, the profits will be higher than the alternative. Okay. However, the effect on risk is the risk will increase because if you have less current assets, you are less liquid. And because you are less liquid, okay, you will be at a higher risk of insolvency simply because you have less current assets to pay for your current liabilities. Okay. So in terms of changes in current assets, that's the profitability and risk impact. Okay. Now let's consider changes in current liabilities and how it impacts working capital management. Okay. Now changing the level of current liabilities affects profitability and the risk trade-off. Okay. Anong impact ng current liabilities sa profitability? Okay. Current liabilities usually are less expensive. Ano ibig sabihin when current liabilities are less expensive? Liabilities in general have a cost. What is the cost of that liability? Pag nangutang ka, what is the cost? The cost is interest. Right? You have to pay for it. Diba? When you borrow, may interest yan. The interest that you have to pay, that is the cost of the financing. Okay? So, current liabilities or liabilities that are short-term in nature are usually less expensive. Okay? No? Less expensive than long-term liabilities. The more long-term a liability is, the more expensive that liability is. Okay? And so therefore, an increase in current liability, also increases profit. Okay? An increase in current liabilities also increases profit. Why? Because cheaper source of funding. Okay. Now, of course, if you have more current liabilities, you have more liabilities that you have to pay in the next month or so, or in the short term. And because of that, the risk of insolvency also rises. Okay, because you have to pay current liabilities within the year or within the business cycle, right? And so therefore, it also increases risk of a company. Okay? And of course, the opposite is true. When current liabilities decrease, okay, what is the effect on profit? It also decreases because you have substituted current liabilities to long-term liabilities. You have more long-term, and long-term is more expensive. Okay? And if your liabilities are more long-term, what is the effect on risk? Your risk decreases. Why? Because dahil long-term siya, hindi mo pa siya kailangan bayaran lahat today or in the next few months. And so therefore, your risk of insolvency decreases. Okay? A critical measure for working capital management is the cash conversion cycle. So we have discussed this, but let us discuss it further. So what is the operating cycle? It's the time from the beginning of the production process to the collection of cash from the sale of the finished product. And so therefore, computing this, it is the days inventory plus days receivable. That is the total operating cycle of a company. However, the cash conversion cycle considers only cash flows, not the operation, the length of time, from production to sale, to collection, right? Cash conversion cycle is the length of time between when a firm pays cash for raw materials and which is when it receives cash from collecting receivables. So cash conversion cycle is operating cycle minus days payable. Now, the objective of working capital management is you want to speed up the cash conversion cycle, because speeding up the cash conversion cycle lowers working capital, right? and therefore makes and maximizes profitability. But of course, lowering working capital also has a limit because you can only tolerate a certain level of risk. Okay, so let's try to illustrate the cash conversion cycle through this diagram. So the operating cycle is this period from payment, from the ordering of inventory up to the receipt or collection of receivables. Okay, so when you buy inventory, okay, you process it and then eventually you sell it. Okay, so this is the days in inventory. That period is the days in inventory. Okay, and then from the point that you sold the product until the point that you received payment, that is the days receivable. Okay, now so that period is the operating cycle. Now what is the cash conversion cycle? Okay, from the time that you bought your inventories, you won't, when you order inventories, you don't pay for it kaagad, right? Binibigyan ka ng credit term ng iyong supplier. For example, pay in 10 days. And so therefore, when you order it, you won't pay for it immediately. There's a period of time, okay, from ordering time, from the time that you ordered to the time that you paid. Okay? And that period is actually the days payable. And so in terms of cash flows, yung ikot ng pera is actually this period. From the time that you paid for your inventories up to the time that you received payment. That's why the cash conversion cycle is shorter. Okay? Because there's a period here wherein you have credit. Okay? There's a period here that you're not paying for the inventory. So cash-wise, yung cash lumabas lang talaga siya during the time that you paid for inventory. And cash pumasok sa sayo when you receive the receivable. And that's the relationship between the operating cycle and the cash conversion cycle. Okay? So our objective is to shorten the cash cycle and the operating cycle as much as possible. Okay? So again, the key term that I'm mentioning is as much as possible because you cannot, it depends on your risk appetite. If you have a low risk appetite, then yung shortening the cash conversion cycle only has a limit. Okay? Another concept that we need to understand is the concept of funding requirements of the cash conversion cycle. So the cash conversion cycle has two basic working capital or funding requirements. Okay? It has a permanent working capital requirement and a seasonal working capital requirement. So what is a permanent working capital requirement? It is a constant investment in operating assets resulting from constant sales over time. Okay? Imagine, if you have constant sales over time, then your inventory levels are more predictable, right? The amount of inventory that you have to buy and you have to, the amount of inventory, that you have to buy is predictable and constant over time. Why would you change inventory levels when constant naman yung sales, right? The receivable that you are expecting will more or less be constant over time, right? And the cash requirements that you need to support operations will also be constant over time. Kung constant lang ang sales over time, why do we need to change them? So that level of cash receivables and inventory that you need to set up so that you can support, okay, constant sales over time, that is the permanent working capital requirement. Ang seasonal naman, edi syempre the portion of sales that you have to fund, okay, because of cyclicality, no, of sales. If sales are cyclical, meaning nag-rise and fall, your requirements for receivables will also rise. Your requirements for inventory will also rise or fall. No? So yung changes, ang tawag doon seasonal operating requirements. Okay? Now, if the firm sales are constant, its investment in operating assets should also be constant. And so therefore, there's a permanent working capital requirement. If the sales are seasonal, then operating assets, investments in operating assets will vary over time with its sales, and therefore there are seasonal components, no, to the working capital. Okay, let's have an example. So this company holds an average 50,000 in cash, 1.25 million in inventories, and 750,000 in accounts receivables. The business is very stable over time, so its operating assets can be viewed as permanent. Okay. Nicholson also has accounts payable of 425,000 that is stable over time. So therefore, okay, Nicholson has permanent investment in working capital. No? So when we say permanent investment in working capital, that's 50,000 na cash plus inventory plus 750,000. If you're talking about permanent investment in net working capital, then that is 50,000 plus 1,250,000 plus 750 less 425,000, which is the accounts payable. Okay, so that's the amount of the permanent working capital. Okay, it's permanent because it's stable. There is no cyclicality in its sales, and therefore, since its sales are stable, the operating assets that you need to support sales is also stable. And that stable amount of operating assets that you need is the permanent working capital requirement. Okay. Let's have an example of a seasonal funding requirement. Okay. So for example, a company has seasonal sales. The company holds at a minimum 25,000 in cash, 100,000 in inventory, and 60,000 accounts receivable. Okay. At peak times, okay, the Semper's inventory increases to 750, and its accounts receivable is increased to 400, and accounts payable remains at 50 throughout the year. Okay. So accordingly, the company has a permanent funding requirement of how much? Yung minimum levels. 135, which is 95, 160 minus 50,000. Remember, we're talking about here of net working capital. Okay. And peak seasonal funding requirement is the excess of its permanent need. Okay. So that is the peak funding requirement minus the permanent funding requirement. So the Semper's total funding requirement may vary from a minimum of 135,000 to a seasonal peak of 1.125 million. Okay. So graphically, it looks like this. Okay. Ito yung parang graph nila ng operating assets, funding requirements. Okay. There's a peak and a minimum. Yung minimum, that is the permanent need. Okay. And these are all seasonal needs. Okay. Because may peaks and valleys depending on the time of the month. Whether it's February, January, depende sa high season ng isang product. Okay. Overall, the total need is between 135,000 to 1.125 million. If this is the working capital need, the next question that you'll have is how do you then fund it? Okay? Alam mo na kailangan ng funding as low as 135 to as high as 1.1 million. Paano mo ngayon popondohan yan? Okay? So, therefore, pupunta na tayo sa financing strategy, no? For working capital purposes. Itong pag-determine ng funding requirement or ng working capital requirement, this is actually the investing part of the decision. Right? Deciding how much should be invested. So that's the portion where you determine what's the minimum need and what's the peak need of the business in terms of working capital requirements. Okay? That's the investment decision part. Now that you have determined, okay, I have determined that I need as low as 135,000 and as high as 1.125 million of net operating assets to fund my operations. The second question now is how do you finance it? Financing decision. Okay? Financing decision na yung second part of our question in working capital policy. Okay? How do you now fund it? So there are two ways to fund it. There's an aggressive financing strategy and a conservative financing strategy. Okay? What's an aggressive financing strategy? A financing strategy is aggressive, no? If the firm funds its seasonal requirements with short-term debt and its permanent requirements with long-term debt or equity. Conservative naman if the firm funds both its seasonal and permanent requirements with long-term debt and or equity. Let's illustrate this with a simple example. Okay. So here, let's try to interpret this graph. Okay. So the shaded area, this one, okay, that one are the permanent working capital requirements of the company. Itong portion na to naman, okay, pertains to the temporary working capital of the company or seasonal working capital requirements of the company. A working capital policy or working capital financing policy is aggressive if yung permanent, even some of the permanent working capital needs is funded by short-term financing. Remember, if there are more short-term financing, okay, what is the impact? Higher profitability, right? Higher risk. In this case, what happens? Okay, yung temporary financing and yung temporary working capital need and some of the permanent working capital need or requirements are both financed by short-term financing, which means the amount of short-term financing is high. And because of that, there's more profitability and there's more risk. That's why pag ganito yung funding policy or financing policy for working capital, right? Then we expect that this investor or this company is actually very aggressive in its profitability. No? Aggressive sila and they can also take more risk. No? Because with more profitability comes more risk in this case. Okay? And since there are more short-term financing, right? Then they're also more agile in terms of working capital, policy. And we'll discuss more of that in the next sessions. Okay. So when we say the working capital financing policy is aggressive, It means that all of the temporary or seasonal working capital requirements plus a portion of the permanent working capital requirements are funded out of short-term financing. Okay? Pag naman yung kabaliktaran, which is conservative working capital policy, working capital financing, what does it mean naman? Okay? It means that if you look at short-term financing here, it's only funding a portion of temporary working capital requirements. Kasi yung long-term financing funds permanent working capital requirements and a portion of temporary working capital needs. Ganun siya ka-conservative. Kahit temporary yung working capital needs, okay, ng kumpanya, permanent or long-term financing pa rin yung gusto niyang gamiting financing. Okay? Because under this strategy, there is less short-term. There is less short-term financing. If there is less short-term financing, there is lower profitability. But there is also lower risk. And since the company wants lower risk, it is more conservative in its working capital funding policy. Okay? Of course, the most ideal is what's called maturity matching working capital strategy. Okay? So this is maturity matching. Okay? Permanent working capital needs are funded by long-term financing. Okay? And temporary working capital needs are funded by short-term financing. Okay? So that is what's called maturity matching financing strategy. You match the maturity of the assets with its financing source. Kung permanent ang working capital requirement, ibig sabihin long-term ang nature ng mga requirements na yan. Kahit kailan, minimum ganyan yung kailangan mong pera. And so therefore, dapat long-term din yung source of funding mo. Okay. Temporary working capital requirements naman, no, varies from time to time. And so therefore, flexible ka rin dapat sa financing strategy mo. And that's what maturity matching means. Is there a correct financing strategy? No, there's not. No, there's none. It depends on the company. Okay. If the company's seasonal requirements are too masyadong erratic, right? It might make sense to have a conservative working capital financing strategy, right? Kasi mahirap mag-adjust ng financing if sobrang lalaki ng differences, no? In terms of the peaks and valleys of your working capital requirements. So it might make more sense to have more long-term financing instead. Okay? Dito ka na lang, mag-finance ka na lang, mag-permanent financing ka na lang at this level. At least kumonti ang variability mo in terms of funding. Konti na lang ang naging kakabahan ka kung meron ka bang pera or wala. No? But for a company, for example, that is very, very stable, it actually makes sense for you to be more aggressive kasi mas predictable. Kahit na may peaks and valleys, predictable naman. And so therefore, an aggressive strategy might be okay for that kind of company. Okay? Let's add more examples. So a company has a permanent funding requirement of 135,000 in operating assets and seasonal funding requirements that vary between 0 and 990,000. And on the average, that amount is 101,250. If the company can borrow short-term funds at 6.25% and borrow long-term funds at 8%, and if it can earn 5% on the investment of any surplus balances, then the annual cost of an aggressive strategy, okay, In this case, let's define aggressive as maturity matching. Okay. Seasonal requirements funded out of current or short-term funding. Permanent requirements funded out of long-term funding. Okay. What will be the cost, no, of what will be the cost of this aggressive strategy? Okay. What's the cost of short-term financing? 6.25% times the average balance of the seasonal financing, which is 101,250. So this is the interest that you're going to pay. Okay. For long-term naman, it's 8% times 135,000. Ang average ng 135,000 throughout the year is 135,000. Because permanent nga siya, hindi siya nagbabago. So ang average balance niya is 135,000. So that costs 10,800. And because you are maturity matching, okay, there is no excess. There's no surplus balance. So zero ang surplus balance. And therefore, there's no earnings or interest from those surplus balances. So the cost of this strategy is 17,128. Okay. So because this strategy, the amount of financing exactly equals the estimated funding need. So there is no surplus balance, kaya ito zero. Okay. Now let's try an example where there is a surplus balance. So let's try a different example. Okay. The company can choose a conservative strategy, and let's define the conservative strategy as all permanent funding. Okay, walang short-term funding. No, all permanent and therefore all long-term funding. Okay? So kung lahat ifa-fund mo, no, then you have to borrow 1.125 million, which is the peak. Okay? So in terms of short-term financing, there's no short-term financing kasi lahat nga long-term. Okay? At kung lahat long-term, you have to borrow 1.125 million. Okay? And the cost is 8%, so the total cost is 90,000. However, you have surplus balances. Hindi naman every time, di ba ang itsura ng graph is ganyan. So 1.125 million yung funding need at some point. 135,000 yung funding need at some point. But if you borrowed 1.25 million all throughout, ibig sabihin meron kang excess cash. Right? And those excess cash can be invested at a return of 5%. 5% times the average excess cash balance. How do you determine this? Let's discuss this. So the average surplus balance would be calculated by subtracting the sum of the permanent need and the average seasonal need from the seasonal peak need. Okay. And that will turn out to be 888,750. So this represents the surplus amount of financing that Semper could invest on the average in short-term assets that earn a 5% return. So yung 135,000, that is the minimum. Okay. Right? Yung 101,250, okay, that's the average of the seasonal needs. Di ba yung mga seasonal need nagbabago from time to time? Their average is this one, yung portion na yan, that's 101,250. Okay? That's why on the average, ito yung portion na excess. So that's 1.125, 1,150,000 minus 101,250 minus 135,000. And that's 888,750. That's the average excess balance. Okay? And so that average excess balance will earn interest of 44,437.50. And if you get the difference, that net cost to you of a conservative strategy is 45,562.50. So it's more expensive to have a conservative strategy. However, doing a conservative strategy gives you the comfort of hindi ka mag-aalala na wala kang pera. May pera ka palagi, yun nga lang mahal, no? Because you have to pay for that long-term financing. Okay? Now, reducing the cash conversion cycle reduces investment in working capital, which frees up cash, no, that can be used for more productive assets. Or you can also distribute it as dividends to your shareholders. That's why managing the cash conversion cycle is important. So to maximize the shareholder wealth of a company, managers should work to minimize the length of the cash conversion cycle to the point that it is comfortable, for the company's risk appetite. So managers can achieve shortening the cash conversion cycle by turning over inventory as quickly as possible, collecting accounts receivable early, processing payments earlier or faster, and to pay accounts payable as slowly as possible without damaging the firm's credit rating with its relationships with suppliers. So inventory management, receivable management, cash management, and accounts payable management. Those are the 4 generic strategies that we can do to reduce the cash conversion cycle of the company, free up cash for more investments for the company. Okay? And we'll discuss each portion in the next videos. Okay? Let's try to, lastly, the last slide for this section, is to have a few industry comparisons. These are 2020 data. So I chose 2 companies, Philex and Lepanto for mining, URC and Mondenisin for consumer goods, and Ayala Land and MegaWorld for property. So if you look at their cash conversion cycles, very different for these industries. No? Right? Obviously, the cash conversion cycle for property companies are longer, right? And between companies, iba-iba rin. So for example, look at mining, 72 days for Philex, 199 days for Lepanto, consolidated. Okay. For URC, 97 and 52 days. If you look at current ratio, different companies also have different profiles in terms of their current ratio. And differences in current ratio reflect working capital management policies, right? Because if your current ratio is less than 1, it means you have more current assets, current liabs, sorry. You have more current liabs versus current assets, and therefore you are more aggressive in terms of working capital policy. Okay? So, and it shows, the more aggressive working capital policy shows when you look at current assets to total assets. It's only 8.9%. It means long-term assets are 11% of the, 91% of the company's assets for Philex. More long-term assets, higher returns, right? So therefore, we can conclude that Philex Lepanto, the mining sector, has a more aggressive working capital strategy. Contrast that against property. The current ratio for property companies is almost always above 1, right? And so therefore, in terms of working capital policy, they are more conservative in terms of working capital policies. And therefore, they should have more current assets than fixed assets, and that's the case. Malaki yung proportion ng current assets nila versus total assets, which means mas maliit yung proportion ng long-term assets versus versus current assets. So this reflects a conservative working capital policy. Okay? Ito naman reflects an aggressive working capital policy, yung for mining. And if you look at Universal Robina and Monde Nissin, looks like they are on the maturity matching side, more or less. No? Of course, not perfectly, but Monde Nissin almost one, right? And URC a little bit over one, but that's not so far away from one. Okay, so consumer goods more or less adheres to something like maturity matching. Okay, so the line of business of a company often also dictates what kind of working capital policy they're going to employ, whether aggressive, conservative, or maturity matching. No? Kasi it also depends on the risk or the variability of the cash flows of a company. Okay, the more variable the cash flows are, then probably they're going to be more conservative in working capital policy. Okay. If it's a little bit more predictable, then probably they're going to be more aggressive in terms of working capital policy. But it also figures into the equation. Okay. All right. That's it for this video. Thank you.